The plains lay quiet, a copper dusk spread thin across the horizon, and the abandoned barn stood like a hollow ribcage against the sinking sun. Boards sagged where storms had clawed them, the roof dipped low as though it had forgotten how to hold its head. There was a silence about it that was not the silence of peace, but of waiting, like an old wound left unhealed. Dust drifted through the warm air in tired spirals, and crows rested on the fence posts, their wings dark against the sky. Elias McGraw rode slowly toward it, reins slack in his calloused hands. He was not a man known for rushing. Time had bent him into patience, though not the content kind. His 39 years carried the weary calm of someone who had lost more than he had gained, and so he moved like one who feared that haste might shatter the fragile rhythm that kept him standing. When the auctioneer's gavel had come down, and the barn had been his for $15, laughter had rippled through the small crowd. $15 for a carcass of wood, they said. $15 for a pile of ghosts. He heard the whispers and did not answer, just touched the brim of his hat and walked away. The horse he rode now, an ordinary chestnut mare, seemed to sense his heaviness. Her hooves struck the dirt with a slow cadence, like a clock ticking in a quiet house. Elias had bought the mare 5 years ago, not long after the fever had taken his wife, and though she served him well, there was little spark between them. He fed, watered, and brushed her, but never spoke her name aloud. To the town, Elias McGraw was the man who bought broken things, old wagons, rusted tools, splintered wood, even animals left behind by less patient men. They said he was soft-hearted to the point of foolishness. They said the land was no place for sentiment. He had learned to carry their words like stones in his pockets, heavy but familiar. As he drew near the barn, the air cooled. A breeze moved through the grass, sighing through the cracks in the barn siding, carrying the smell of damp wood and something else, something sour, like iron left too long in the rain. Elias slid from the saddle, boots crunching against dry earth, and tied his mare to a post that sagged under her weight. He stood a moment, hand on the worn leather of the reins, listening. Nothing stirred, only the creak of boards, the whine of wind. Inside, the barn was a cathedral of shadows. His lantern flame caught dust motes that swirled like tiny spirits, drifting between beams of dying light. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of rot, and each step he took set the floor groaning. He had expected emptiness, perhaps the carcass of an old plow, broken barrels, a nest of field mice. What he did not expect was a sound that came from the far stall, a long, low exhale, so deep it vibrated in his bones. He froze, breath snagged in his throat. Another exhale followed, rougher, like the earth itself sighing. Slowly, Elias raised his lantern. At first all he saw was the gleam of two eyes, catching the light from the dark. They were not the bright eyes of some wild thing, but weary, sunken, rimmed with sorrow. Then the shape revealed itself, vast shoulders, a neck thick as a tree trunk, a body so massive it filled the stall, like a mountain wedged into wooden walls. A horse, but no ordinary one. Bigger than any draft animal Elias had ever seen, scarred along its flank, ribs faintly visible beneath its immense frame. Chains bound its legs loosely, the kind used not for taming, but for keeping a creature abandoned in place. For a long time man and beast watched each other. The horse did not lunge, did not rear, did not even step forward. It only breathed, deep and steady, as though measuring him. Elias's lantern shook faintly in his hand, throwing wild shadows along the beams. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. And yet, in the silence, something else swelled, something softer. He saw not a monster, but a prisoner. Not fury, but exhaustion. "Lord, have mercy," Elias whispered, though the words were more to himself than to heaven. He backed away, not from fear, but to steady his own hands. Outside, he found the bucket left overturned near the well, filled it with water that shone pale under the dusk, and carried it inside. The horse's eyes followed him, unblinking, as he set the bucket down within reach. For a moment the creature did not move. Then, with a slow bend of its head, it drank. The sound of its throat working was the only music in the barn, and Elias felt something unravel in his chest, a knot he had not known he carried. When he returned to town the next morning, leading a wagon with sacks of feed piled in the back, heads turned. Whispers followed him from porch to porch. Old Mrs. Crowder spat into the dirt and said he was wasting his coin on a beast that would trample him before it ever plowed a field. Sheriff Allen leaned on the post outside the saloon and told him plain, "You do better to put a bullet in it, McGraw. Some things ain't worth saving." Elias tipped his hat, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that words seldom soften judgment. Still, he felt the weight of their eyes as he carried grain and medicine toward the barn. They thought him foolish, soft, less of a man. They did not know the silence he went home to each night, the way the empty chair across his table seemed to breathe like a ghost, the way grief settled on him like a second skin. Perhaps it was foolishness. But perhaps foolishness was all that kept a man alive when loneliness tried to bury him. He spent days bringing the horse back to strength. Each morning he rose before sunup, carried water, brushed the matted hair, cleaned the wounds along its flank with rag and patience. At first the horse refused to be touched, pressing itself into the corner of the stall, eyes flashing with old pain. Goliath did not push. He sat quietly nearby, humming broken fragments of hymns he half remembered from childhood, letting his presence fill the space without demand. Sometimes he read aloud from the Bible he no longer believed in, his voice steady in the shadows, not preaching but simply speaking, so the silence did not claim them both. It was nearly 2 weeks before the horse lowered its great head enough for him to brush along its mane. The coarse hair tangled his fingers, and he whispered without thinking, "You and me, we're both left behind." The horse's ears flicked, and for a heartbeat Elias imagined it understood. Word spread quickly, as gossip always does. By the 3rd week, the horse was the talk of every porch and store in town. Some came out to the ranch just to glimpse it from a distance, whispering of curses or omens. The children dared one another to sneak close, but their mothers pulled them back, muttering that Elias was touched in the head. In the saloon, laughter rolled when his name was spoken. The man who bought a barn for $15 and found himself a monster inside. He carried the laughter like another stone in his pocket. Yet there was one pair of eyes that watched him differently. Clara May Whitlock, who kept the apothecary, had been a widow for nearly as long as Elias had been alone. She moved through town quietly, skirts brushing the dusty boards, eyes downcast, her hands always busy with herbs and tinctures. When Elias came for liniment, she asked no questions, though her gaze lingered on the cuts along his forearms. A day later, he found a small jar of salve left on his porch, no note, no knock. Another time, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth appeared on his doorstep. He did not thank her aloud, but the quiet gestures reached deeper than words. Still, it was the horse who filled his thoughts. He named it Goliath, though the name was more reverent than mocking. In the evenings, when the sun slipped low and the lantern glowed warm, he brushed Goliath's coat until it shone faintly in the dark. The barn, once a tomb, now breathed with life. The sound of chewing hay, the steady rhythm of the giant's breath, the flick of its tail, all became Elias's anchor. He felt the edges of his loneliness soften, not vanish but loosen, like chains beginning to rust away. One night, as the lantern light flickered, Elias leaned against the stall door, watching Goliath drink. He felt the stirrings of something he had not felt in years, a fragile hope, the kind that trembles because it knows how easily it can be broken. He whispered, "Maybe the Lord's not done with either of us yet." The horse raised its head, water dripping from its muzzle, and for a long moment they regarded each other in the golden glow. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of rain. The barn creaked, but the sound was no longer mournful. It was the sound of wood remembering its strength. Elias closed his eyes, listening, and when he opened them again, he smiled faintly. He had bought a ruin, and found within it a giant chained not only by iron, but by the world's forgetting. In that they were the same. And though the town's laughter would follow him still, Elias knew the story was not done. Something was beginning here, slow as dawn, steady as breath. And beginnings, he thought, are worth the weight of every stone a man must carry. Weeks folded into one another, and the barn was no longer hollow silence, but a place of steady rhythm. Each dawn Elias rose, and each dawn Goliath raised his head to greet him with a snort that misted in the cool air. The horse's strength returned gradually, muscle thickening over bone, a shine stirring in the once dull eyes. Elias felt himself changing too, though he could not name the change. It was not joy, exactly, nor peace, but something that softened the edges of his days, as though the world had grown less empty simply because he was no longer tending only to himself. Still, the town did not let him forget. Every trip into Main Street was shadowed by murmurs. Men leaned on saloon rails, muttering that the beast was a danger to everyone. Mothers pulled their children aside when Elias passed, whispering warnings about his madness. A few of the bolder ones told him outright that mercy would be to put the creature down. "Chains are not a life," one man said, "and that horse'll break yours before long." Elias did not answer. He simply tipped his hat and carried his supplies back to the wagon. Yet their words lingered, clinging to him on the long ride home, as though every kindness he gave Goliath was measured against the town's judgment. Clara May began to visit the barn herself. At first, she made excuses, a delivery of herbs, an ointment she insisted must be applied with careful hands. But in time, the excuses fell away. She came because she wanted to. She moved gently, her skirts brushing the straw, her eyes lifting now and then to the giant horse who watched her with solemn patience. Goliath did not shy from her touch. Perhaps Elias thought the horse knew the shape of grief as well as they did. The two of them worked side by side, not speaking much. Words felt unnecessary, even heavy between them. Instead, their silence grew companionable. Elias mended a loose beam in the apothecary one evening, hammering nails until dusk, and when she pressed a jar of blackberry preserves into his hands in thanks, neither spoke of the act itself. It was not romance, not yet, but something slower, steadier, a recognition, like two solitary souls acknowledging one another without daring to break the fragile spell by naming it. But the town's patience was fraying. Sheriff Hanlon came one afternoon, riding up the dirt path with two deputies at his side. He dismounted stiffly, hat pulled low, and stood before Elias with a jaw set like stone. "McGraw," he said, "we've tolerated your experiment long enough. Folks are uneasy. That horse of yours is too big, too wild. If it breaks free, it won't just trample you. It'll tear through half the county." His deputies nodded, hands hovering near their revolvers, as if even in the barn shadows they expected an ambush. Elias kept his gaze steady. "Goliath's no danger to anyone," he said quietly. "He's been hurt, but he ain't cruel." Hanlon shook his head. "You're blinded by pity. Sooner or later, he'll remind you what he is. And when that happens, it won't just be your blood spilled." The warning hung in the air. Elias said nothing more, but inside, his chest tightened with doubt. He had come to believe in Goliath's gentleness, but belief did not shield him from fear. Each night, when the horse shifted in its stall, Elias woke with his heart pounding, wondering if he was wrong. Yet every dawn proved his faith right again. The horse met him with calm eyes, not rage. The summer deepened and storms began to roll across the plains, thick and violent, tearing roofs from sheds and flooding low fields. One evening, the sky boiled black and green, and thunder cracked so close the air itself seemed to split. Rain hammered the earth, turning paths to rivers of mud. Elias sat in the barn, lantern flickering, as Goliath stamped nervously against the storm. He stroked the horse's neck, speaking low, until the beast stilled. Outside, wind clawed at the walls, but inside there was a fragile island of calm. The next morning brought news that fire had struck the town. Lightning had set a roof ablaze, and the blaze spread quick across the row of sheds by the livery stable. When Elias rode in, smoke still curled into the sky, and half the town stood gathered, faces pale with fear. The shouts of children echoed from within the collapsed barn where they had taken shelter. Men pulled at beams, but the wreckage held fast. Flames licked the edges, and smoke thickened until the air was unbreathable. Panic spread like the fire itself. Elias saw it in a flash, the wreckage too heavy, the children too deep inside, the men too frantic to make headway. And then, unbidden, his gaze turned back toward his ranch, toward Goliath. Without speaking, he turned his mare and galloped harder than he had in years. Mud sprayed up in clumps, wind roared in his ears, and fear pressed against his ribs. When he reached the barn, Goliath met him with wild eyes, sensing the urgency in his movements. Elias grabbed the chain, yanked it loose, and spoke in a voice that trembled with more prayer than command. "Come on, boy. They need you." They thundered into town together, man and giant, and gasps broke through the crowd as they saw the beast appear through smoke. Some screamed warnings, others cursed, but Elias did not slow. He led Goliath straight to the burning ruin, his own body braced for disaster. At the threshold, the horse balked, nostrils flaring at the heat, ears flattening at the roar of fire. Elias pressed a hand against the great neck, speaking low, steady as he could. "I'm here. You're not alone. Just one more burden to carry." For a moment, Goliath's gaze caught his, and then the horse stepped forward. The ground shook with the force of his weight. Chains clattered against his sides as he pushed into the blaze. Elias led, coughing through smoke, his eyes stinging, but he felt the giant behind him, immense, steady, unshaken once he had chosen to move. Together they reached the collapsed beams. Elias pointed, and with a mighty shove of his shoulder, Goliath heaved the timbers aside, sending sparks flying. Cries rang out from within as daylight pierced the dark. One by one, the children stumbled out, coughing, eyes wide, until the last was carried by a girl no older than 12. When the last child was safe, Elias pulled Goliath back, both of them emerging through the smoke like specters. The crowd fell silent. Even the fire seemed to quiet for a moment, as if pausing in reverence. The sheriff stood frozen, hat clutched in his hands, eyes fixed on the horse who had saved where men could not. Elias felt his knees weaken. His lungs burned, his skin blistered where sparks had caught his shirt, but he leaned into Goliath's side, trembling with relief. The horse lowered its head, pressing against him with surprising gentleness, and Elias let out a breath that was half sob, half laughter. Later, when the fire was out and the children clutched safe in their mother's arms, the town gathered around him. No one spoke mockery now. Faces were solemn, humbled, ashamed. Sheriff Hamlin stepped forward, voice rough. "Looks like we were wrong." He paused, swallowing hard. "Looks like you saw what we didn't." Elias only nodded. Words felt small against the weight of what had passed. That night, Clara May came to the barn. She found him sitting on a bale of hay, lantern low, Goliath's great head resting nearby, like a sentinel at rest. She knelt without a word, gently dabbing ointment on the burns along his arms. Her touch was careful, steady, as though afraid to break him. When she was done, she did not pull away. She simply sat beside him in silence. After a time, her hand brushed his. It was not a declaration, not even a promise, but it was enough. The barn was quiet, save for the sound of Goliath's breathing. Elias closed his eyes, the weight of years lifting, if only a little. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt not just alive, but accompanied. And as the night deepened, he thought of the lesson buried in all, that even the heaviest, most broken things can find redemption, if only someone is stubborn enough to see their worth. Perhaps it was foolishness. Perhaps it was grace. But in that fragile space where the two met, life breathed again. So if ever you find yourself walking past ruins, or mocked for loving what the world has cast aside, remember this. Sometimes the most impossible creatures are the ones that carry us through fire. Sometimes salvation comes not in thunder or triumph, but in the quiet choosing of mercy. And sometimes if you are patient enough to wait in the silence, you may find the giant you feared was only waiting for someone to believe.